So today we're going to start the orders of insects, but before we get to the actual orders of insects and sort of take a survey of all those orders of insects, we really need to spend a little bit of time again talking about some of the terminology that we're going to be using in here, some of the other features and other attributes that we have in this class Hexapoda. Remember, we started out talking about the arthropods and saying one of the features of the arthropods is that they have segmented bodies. The segmented bodies are arranged in these functional body units, the tagmata, and in essence what we find, the one that really has the 3 tagmata is the standard for the entire class is the Insecta or the Hexapoda. So now we're going to have a defined head, thorax, and abdomen. They're going to be distinctively separated. They're going to have distinctive, what I say, operations that go on with the body. Now let's think about this. What do you think the insect head does? What does your head do? You probably never thought of it that way, but what does your head do? Yeah, it's got your really major sensory organs. That's where your eyes are. That's where the eyes of the insects are. In your case, most of your chemoreception, your mouth, your nose is located in the head. Now what we're going to find is that there are major chemoreceptors in an insect's head, and they're mainly concentrated about the mouth parts, and they're concentrated on the antennae. But when we get to chemoreception in that section of this course, we're going to find out that there can be chemical receptors anywhere on the body of an insect. The legs, the abdomen, the thorax, even the genitalia can have taste organs on it. That's pretty kinky, okay? But the reality is that they can, the primary chemoreceptors are usually the antennae and parts of the mouth parts. Those would be the primary ones, and you can imagine that's what's to be expected. You don't want to eat something that you haven't tasted first, and so there's going to be those chemoreceptors around there. And in order to get from one place to another, that's why the chemoreceptors are in the antennae. And so they don't have a nose like we have, but they do have primary chemoreceptors. We've already talked about the thorax. What is primarily in the thorax of most of these arthropods? Muscles. And in the case of the insects, they're not only going to be the muscles that operate the legs, but the vast majority of insects also have a pair of wings on them, or 2 pairs of wings. So now you're going to have to increase that thoracic size to house the muscles that operate the wings. And again, if you're going to eat an insect, if you want the maximum protein out of that insect, eat the thorax. I've actually seen things like yellow jackets and bull-faced hornets catch other insects. They quite often snip off the head, they pull off the legs, the wings, and the abdomen goes rolling off, and all they take back to the nest is the thorax, because that has all the muscles, and the muscles or the protein is what they're going to feed their larvae back at the nest. What did I indicate was in the abdomen? It's just basically this bulbous sac made up of ring segments, but that's the thing that has mainly the digestive organs, the excretory organs, the equivalent of your kidneys, but insects don't have a kidney, and the reproductive organs. That's where the testes and the ovaries are going to be. And so the abdomen is very important, but since there's usually not many appendages on it, there's no need for muscles to operate those parts. So again, sensory, food input. Also the head is where the primary ganglia that operate the body, so we often call that the brain in that area. The thorax, I usually say, is the locomotor tagmata. And then finally the abdomen, that's where the guts reside and the other stuff. The thorax of all insects is made of 3 primary segments. So the original segments, there are 3 of these, and so we divide them up. We often say the first segment is the prothoracic segment. Then there's a middle segment, the mesothoracic segment, and then the third segment is the metathoracic segment. I just wanted to introduce those terms to you. We'll use them time and time again, but I just wanted to kind of mention them to you. The vast majority of insects, now the reason why I keep hedging my bet on this when I say the vast majority of insects, there are some insects, primarily parasitic insects, things like lice and fleas, have secondarily lost their wings. When you go through this parasitic existence, having to live on an animal, you don't want these wings interfering with your movement being around on that animal. Likewise, there's a couple of really ancestral insects, the ones that we think are at the very base of the evolutionary scale of developing into the hexapods, that never had wings to begin with. But 99% of the insect species are in the groups that have wings. When they have wings, they normally have 2 pairs of wings. But even there, you'll notice I've made a hedge mark. I said normally. And the reason for that is that if you take a look at a fly looks like it only has 1 pair of wings. Actually, it has 2 pair of wings. The hind pair of wings have been reduced into these little knobs that act as gyroscopes to keep the fly flying straight when it's flying. So we think the ancestral form is to have those 2 pairs of wings, but those 2 pair of wings only appear in the adult. The head, being a mandibulate arthropod, is going to have a pair of antennae. And again, they're on the group that has 1 pair of antennae, as opposed to our crustacea that had those 2 pair of antennae. Respiration is done instead of gills attached to the legs. What we're going to find in the crustacea, what we're going to find is that insects respire using a bunch of tubes that go through the body, and those tubes are called trachea. The tubes open to the outside at specific points. There's usually paired points in each of the thoracic and abdominal segments where those tracheal tubes hit to the outside, and so they can exchange air. And we find the term for those openings are called spiracles. And again, we'll mention that again in greater detail later on. Most of the insects, again, are terrestrial. There are some freshwater species, especially, again, some of the more ancestral ones, have actually freshwater immatures, while the adult lives outside and is a terrestrial organism. Not on here. What would be some other attributes of these insects that they share with the rest of the arthropods? They have a ventral nerve cord. Okay, so they're going to have that attribute that they share. They're going to have a hemocoel. They're going to have a blood cavity. In other words, they don't have a closed circulatory system. The blood just sort of sloshes around inside of their body, and as they move around, that sloshes this blood. And so, since they've got these trachea that carry oxygen to the cells and the CO2, the respiratory byproducts, away from the cells, the blood doesn't have to be involved with that. So the blood is really more of a nutrient bath. It's just providing nutrients to the cells that they supply. Now we're going to divide, just like we divided up the arthropods in the mandibulates and the chelicerates. Now we're going to use basically the life cycles to divide up the insects. And we find that there are 2 primary life cycle groups. Now, I know in some textbooks they talk about 3 different life cycle groups, but I prefer to keep it fairly simple. And the first one is what we call a simple metamorphosis life cycle. There are all kinds of terms for this. It can be gradual metamorphosis, incomplete metamorphosis, and so forth. But in essence, what they're saying is that when the immature of an insect in this group hatches out of the egg, you can pretty well tell what it is. It looks pretty much like the adult. It's just going to be smaller, and it's not going to have wings. The terms that we use for these is that we say that they have 3 stages in their life cycle. Now this is going to get a little complicated because we're going to talk about stages and instars and some other things. So bear with me. We'll try to go through this a couple of different times. So in this case, the first stage is the egg. Then the immature stage will be the nymph. And all the nymph is an immature form of this insect. And when I say immature, I mean that it doesn't have functioning ovaries and testes. It's sexually immature. The nymphs also do not have wings. The nymphs are going to have external wing pads, places where the tissue are developing where they will eventually become wings, but it's only the adult that will have wings. And the definition of the adult is that it's now sexually mature. There will be males and females with functional testes and ovaries. The vast majority of insects, over 80% of the insect species, have what we call a complete life cycle. And in this particular case, what we find is that they will have, again, the egg stage, but now they have an immature that we're going to call a larva. And this immature is not going to look like the adult. It's going to be typically very different. I'm here to, well, you know these. What's the immature? What's the larva of a butterfly? A caterpillar. That doesn't look anything like a butterfly. What's the larva of a fly? A maggot. Yeah. That worm-like thing with no legs on it doesn't look anything like a fly with the wings and the legs and so forth. So, and that's what we see is that the immatures, and a lot of it makes entomology really tough, because to really study an insect, especially one of these that has a complete life cycle, you've got to be able to study and understand the larval stage of it as well as the adult stage of it. Now, to get to the adult stage, there has to be what we call a transformation stage. So the pupa is the transformation stage. Unfortunately, in a lot of books and a lot of places, they say the pupa is the resting stage. Oh boy, does that really freak out entomologists. Just like what we saw in your videos, when you're shedding your exoskeleton, you don't want to be moving around because it can mess things up for the next stage when you molt out of that. So just think about it. For a caterpillar, not only am I creating a new exoskeleton, I'm basically creating an entire new form of animal. I'm creating something that has these wings. I'm creating things that where there were these little stumpy little legs and prolegs. Now I need really long legs so that I can very delicately land on a flower. And where I had mouth parts that chewed plant material, now I'm going to have a long soda straw that I can uncoil and suck out nectar out of the flowers. Really different forms. And so physiologically, that pupa is without a doubt one of the most active stages of the insect, but it's not moving. It's not in a place where it wants to be disturbed because it's undergoing that magic transformation of rearranging all of its internal organs and its external form to come out as a new adult. And then in the adult, typically of this group, they're going to have wings. They're going to be able to fly and move around that way, and they're going to have sexually mature ovaries and testes so that they can get together, mate, and reproduce. Any questions on those? We'll try to cover. We're going to go into this in greater detail. I'll give you some examples of these. Now, the first one that I'm going to do is just give you a diagram. Sometimes it's easier without having the complexity of colors and other things getting in the way of these to just sort of give you an example of the colors of these. So in this one, I'm going to pick an insect that I work with. The hairy chinch bug is a very common sucking pest of turf grass, and so I've got plenty of pictures of these. And what I want to start out with first is that how many stages did I tell you were here? 3. Does that look like 3 stages to you? No, but indeed, there are 3 stages here. We have the egg stage, the nymphal stage and the adult stage. But we have these sub-stages of development. So in the nymphal stage, every time that nymph reaches a certain size, it can't get any bigger without shedding its exoskeleton. So it has to shed its exoskeleton multiple times to finally achieve the adult size. Those forms that it takes between the molts is called the instar. So let me repeat that. The form that the immature takes between molts is called the instar. And for every insect, there's a set number of instars for that group of insects. Give you an example. If you're a Japanese beetle, you go through 3 larval instars. If you're a gypsy moth, it gets even weirder here. If you're a gypsy moth male caterpillar, you'll go through 5 larval instars. If you're a female, you'll go through 6. That seems kind of odd. Why would the gypsy moth female larva go through another instar? She needs to be bigger. She's got to produce eggs. Absolutely. So in order to be bigger and to produce the eggs, she goes through an extra instar. It doesn't take much to produce sperm. So the 5th instars or 5 instars is all that needed. So each group of insects, and quite often it might be even certain families of insects within orders, can have different numbers of instars. Just so happens that with the chinch bugs, there are 5 nymphal instars in all chinch bugs. And as a matter of fact, most bugs in general have 5 nymphal instars. Now there are some differences in a few of those, but most of them have that. Now what you can't really see on this black and white diagram is the wing pads being developed and eventually unfurling as the full wings of the adult. So is everybody, I know this gets confusing. There are 3 stages, but there can be a variable number of nymphal instars in there. Now let me show you the same thing with the actual specimens. And so here's some pictures that I took. Here you're going to say, gee, Dr. Shetler, you lied to me. There seems to be more going on here. Yes, there is, but in general, that thing that I mentioned to you is correct. We have the egg stage, the nymphal stage, and the adult stage. Now in the nymphs, we can see that with some color, there is a little bit of difference. They start out primarily as red-orange in color with a white band on them. When they get into the 4th instar, they begin to turn more of a purple color. When they get into the 5th instar, they're really dark purple. That white band almost completely disappears. Also, you can see now the wing pads being developed. These are going to be the tissues that eventually will form the fully developed wings of the adult. So the next time that this molts, there's not much that it has to change. It just molts into the adult. It doesn't have to go through a transformation stage at that time. Also notice that there's 2 forms of the adults. In this case, there's a fully winged form, and then there's a short-winged form. And what we find in turfgrass, chinch bugs typically have about 3 generations. They complete 3 complete cycles during the summertime. What we find is that most of them overwinter as fully winged adults. In that first generation, they produce primarily short-winged adults. In the second generation, it's about 50-50, short-winged adults and fully winged adults. And then in the 3rd generation, they're virtually all winged adults. What in the world's going on here? Well, we think what's going on, or our hypothesis is that once they find food that they can feed on in the springtime, there's no reason to go somewhere else. And so you don't need wings to fly and move off to somewhere else. But late in the season, when you need to find a place to go hide for the wintertime, it helps to be able to fly. And so you can fly away from the turf and find some weedy areas and leaf litter and things like that and hide. Then in the springtime, fly back in. and start your feeding on the grasses and so forth. So biologically it makes sense. Why waste energy making wings if you're not going to use them? Yet later on in the season, when you need those wings, you better have them. And there's a penalty to pay for having those wings. Generally, the winged adults are just a little bit smaller than the non-winged adults. Now, just like we studied with those insects that have that incomplete life cycle, those that have the complete life cycle now have those 4 stages. They're going to have the egg stage, they're going to have the larval stage, the pupal stage, and the adult stage. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're really going to only apply that instar to the larval stage. And so, as I indicated to you, instar is given to the name or of the shape and form of the insect that it takes as an immature between molts. And in this case, with this white grub, what we see is that there are 3 larval instars. Now, there are some other beetles that have 4 larval instars and some other beetles that have 5 larval instars. So again, it depends on which family of beetles that you're in, the number of instars that you have, but all scarabs, and that's what this May-June beetle is, all scarabs have 3 of these C-shaped larval instars. Now look at that larva. Now this larva looks nothing like the adult. We call them white grubs or grub-like forms. They're sort of C-shaped. You can see they have little tiny legs. The antennae are virtually not even visible on here. It's just a little spike that sticks out of there. And this is perfectly fine for them because typically mom has laid eggs where my food is. So when I hatch out, all I really need to be able to do is sort of wiggle around in my food area and just hoover it down as fast as I can. In order to reach the adult stage, however, I've got to go through a transformation. And it's really kind of interesting when they molt into this pupal stage. What you can see is that the exoskeleton kind of forms a template for what's going to be under there. You can actually see the legs are folded up here. You can see where the head's going to be. Here's the antennae, the primordial antennae. This big flap right here is going to be the elytra or the wing covers of that beetle. And again, this thing's not going to be moving around. As a matter of fact, these white grubs usually feed really high up in the soil thatch interface and turf grass. When they're ready to pupate, they'll dig down about 1.5 inches to 2 inches down in the soil because they want a constant temperature, constant humidity, and nothing bothering them while they're undergoing the transformation stage. So again, 4 stages, but there can be multiple instars. Now, why is this important? Well, if you're managing these, it's really important because if you go out and try to control these white grubs, which of those white grubs do you think you will be easiest to kill with an insecticide? Yeah, the first one, the little ones. It takes less insecticide to kill that first one. And so I need to know what is the time of the year that they're primarily first instar grubs. That's when I want to time my insecticide. Right now we're in 3rd instar grubs, and I'm getting called from lawn care people and golf course superintendents and say, Dr. Scheller, what should I do? I've got these big honking grubs out here that the skunks and raccoons are digging up and eating. And I say, you got a 50-pound bag of insecticide? Yeah, take it out and drop it on them. It'll probably kill them better than if you spread it out and try to kill them that way. You should have used that 50-pound bag of insecticide a month and a half ago. That's when they would have been first instars. As you can tell, I'm a little mean and nasty with people that don't do things right. Here's what the actual critters look like. Again, these are just some pictures of them. You can see the little white egg. Now, in this case, I actually deliberately picked this first instar larva that had just hatched out of the egg, and I think you can see that. Yeah, you could probably fold that up and stick it into the egg. But after a day or two of feeding, the abdomen, which is sort of telescoped together, will expand on out and become larger, but eventually it's going to fill up that exoskeleton, and once it's filled up the exoskeleton, it's going to have to molt, shed that, and get into the second instar. And again, that second instar is going to have its exoskeleton. We'll talk about the way that it folds it and can telescope the segments together. But eventually, once that exoskeleton is hardened and it fills it all the way up, it's got to molt and get into the third instar. I picked this pupa out of the soil, and look what's still attached to it. There's the old shed skin of the third instar larva. It was still stuck to the end of that, but you can see that it shed that exoskeleton and formed sort of the template of what will eventually become the beetle. Any questions on this? Yeah. The question is it typical for the third instar to be bigger than the adult? In most insects, once you stop feeding, you're still using energy. You're using your fat stores and body stores and so forth. So you're actually probably going to be losing weight until you reach the adulthood, and then you can eat again and build it up. I didn't point that out, but if you actually go back and look at the chinch bug pictures, that fifth instar nymph is actually bigger than the adult. And that's because, again, it stops feeding, has to go through the transformation stage to get to the adult, and the adult is often a little bit smaller in size. Yes?
Are there any other differences between the second and the third instar besides just the size change?
Yeah, the question here is there a difference in other attributes between the second and third instar? In white grub, no. It's primarily just a size thing. In some other insects, primarily in what we consider to be parasitic insects, we can find that they actually change dramatically in form in the larval instars. To give you an example, there's a little parasitic beetle that parasitizes bee nests. The first instar larva looks like a little lizard, and it runs around. It has to be able to run around to find the nest of a solitary bee, dig into that nest, and then once it finds the nest and it finds the bee grub or the bee larva, it will actually chew its way into that. Now that it's in the side of its host, the next time it molts, it just molts into this really fat, almost legless grub-like thing because it doesn't have to move anymore. So it looks very different than the first. So in some insects, and especially those that have those weird life cycles of being parasites, the different forms of the instars can be quite different. But for a caterpillar, you see a small caterpillar, it looks very much like a big caterpillar. They're not going to change all that much.